Welcome back to the internet, everybody. Welcome back to the internet. Welcome back to the channel, internet, YouTubes. Man, let's see if I can spit this out. So this is my favorite era of motorcycling. In response to Gorilla Biker, who did a video on his favorite era, left an open challenge to the motovlogging community, and this is my response. I haven't seen everybody's response yet. I watched Hippo Drones the other night, and I think Webb just published his, I believe. I saw a notification for that, so I'll probably watch his after this and make my rounds, watch as many of them as I can. There's been a lot of response to Gorilla Biker's first video, and let's take it away. But before we do that, I just want to let you know, this is my third attempt at it. I've been riding for about 45 minutes, and I started it, and I thought my camera was off by accident, so I turned the camera back on. I could see the little lights blink. I started it over again, and then the camera shut off again. Realized the battery was dead, so let's get started. So I have two favorite eras, one for motocross and one for street bikes. Favorite era for motocross, let's start with that one first. That would be the early to mid 1980s, probably the whole 1980 decade. And the reason why is because that's when America stopped sucking at motocross. Let me take a step back, give you a quick history lesson. Motocross is not a U.S. or an American sport. It started in Europe. The Swedes, the UK, Great Britain, England. Not sure what the proper reference is, but we'll go with UK. I like acronyms. The United Kingdom, the UK, the Swedes, and there's a third country that was really badass at motocross way back in the day. Can't remember them right now. It'll come to me later. So in 1947. They started this annual race called the Motocross Des Nations. It's essentially the Olympics of motocross. 3 riders from dozens of countries get together and race each other. It's a unique race because typically you're racing with people that are, you know, I won't say enemy, but your competition. You're racing with and trying to team up and work together with somebody that normally at all the other races you're trying to beat. You're trying to beat them every weekend. And for this one race, you guys have to come together and compete against other countries that are doing the same thing. So that's pretty cool. This started, I think, in 1947, sometime after World War II. And the UK, Sweden, what the heck is the third country I can't think of right now? Essentially, they pretty much owned that race for many, many years. And then the Belgians got really good. And the Belgians went on a tear for years. They just dominated it. And then all the while, the Americans kind of sucked pretty bad. They were pretty horrible at it. And some of these Europeans started coming over to the United States, racing the Americans. Of course, they pretty much kicked everybody's butt. They would also come over to promote motorcycles. And it's easy to promote a bike when you're winning races with it. And everybody at the track, not just people you're racing against, but the spectators, they see you kicking butt and winning by big margins, and they're like, what's he riding, right? Eventually, the Americans started to catch on to the Europeans in terms of riding technique and style, and it wasn't until 1981, but the Americans finally almost 40 years, well, we'll say 30 years after the event started, finally the Americans won their first motocross destinations. I don't know how long they were actually competing in the race. I just know that that was the first year they actually won it. And then the Americans went on a tear and just owned everybody at that race for quite some time to come, maybe a decade, maybe a little bit more. They just dominated. They didn't just win, they won by margins, huge margins. And we went back and forth with other countries. France, as of late, has won a lot of the motocross destinations. America's won a few here and there. But I think over the last 30, America's won 22. Go USA. So that's my favorite era for motocross. Plus, the bikes were all two-strokes in the 80s. I'm not a huge fan of the four-stroke. The prices of them have gone sky high. The aftermarket parts for four strokes, crazy sky high. And they're just, it's mostly about money. They're just more expensive to purchase and to maintain if you're riding a lot. Look at that little car. Pretty sweet. I'm not going to get this light unless a car comes up here. That's what's going to happen. This light's never going to turn for me. Well, I will sit here and yap about my favorite street bike era, and that is right here, right now. I love this motorcycle so much. I think for me, the newest bikes, the electronics, certain aspects of the electronics are starting to get carried away. I just cannot stand the idea of drive-by-wire, fly-by-wire, throttle-by-wire. I said fly-by-wire because this conversation came up in another topic came up in another conversation I was having with somebody, and they were talking about the latest Air Force fighting jet, the F-35. It's all fly-by-wire, and I think some of the latest and great. Wow, the light's finally turning. It recognized my existence. So, throttle by wire. I'm sorry, that's where the electronics start to leave me a little bit. Oh, that dude looked like he'd been around. Thanks for waving. Thanks for waving. I don't think any of them waved. So, what am I talking about? What's up, dude? He waved. Lots of bikes on this road, man. Lots of bikes. What's going on, guys? What's going on? Yeah. Thanks for waving. So many bikes. All I'm doing in this video is waving to other bikes. There's another one right there by himself. Yep. Thank you for waving back, sir. So yeah, the electronics. Like, this bike has got electronics, but not the whole package that the modern bikes today have. For example, I have a toggle switch here. I can change the power levels. It's got 3 different levels. I can change the traction control. I think it has 3 different levels, plus you can turn it off completely. And I think that's most of the electronics on this bike, aside from obviously we have fuel injection and things of this nature, right? I like some aspects of the newer electronic systems, but the fact that you no longer have a cable attached, connected to your hand through this throttle grip, and on the other end it connects to your throttle bodies and actually turns the butterflies, that's where you lose me. That's where I think we've gone too far. I get it for racers, whether you're just doing track days or you actually race local or all the way to the best of the best, right? The current version of this bike has basically the same electronic package that all the bikes have nowadays, right? You've got 4, 5, 6 gazillion accesses. So the bike knows when it's leaning over to one side or the other. It knows when it's doing a wheelie. It knows when it's doing an endo or a stoppie. Why do we have to rename that? It was called an endo. And so, oh no, we're doing a stoppie. You're doing an endo, okay? It was called an endo before anybody was doing that, and it should still be called an endo. All right, rant over. So the bikes know things like, hey, I'm leaned over. They probably even know to like what degree they're leaned over. And I saw this great video on Jonathan Ray's 2017 championship winning bike.
The final thing is the electronics. Now this bike just makes weird noises everywhere you go around the track. The engine braking control, the fact that it's got twin throttle bodies, so in the middle of the corner 2 throttle bodies shut down, so you're only really running on 2 cylinders, so you've got a lot less torque in the middle of the corner, up to about 20-30%. So the bike's a lot more manageable, so it kind of gurgles as it's at full lean, like a big bang engine really. And then as you lift the bike up and go full throttle, then you've got the full glory of a 4-cylinder screamer at your right wrist. And then you've got the traction control and the anti-wheelie. Now you've got to really trust the electronics. If you feather the throttle out of the corner, you confuse the electronics. So the technique, which is easier said than done, is just to come out of the corner and just pin it.
That's super cool. Do I care about that on the street? No. Might be a feature I would tinker with if I was still doing track days and racing, but I'm not, so I don't care. I don't think that they've gone too far with that. I think that's cool, right? I think it takes a little bit away from the rider. Like, go back to MotoGP, before it was called MotoGP, when Mick Doohan was racing 500 two-strokes. They didn't have any of this fancy crap on their bike, and it was more about rider feel. Now, to be a successful race team at that level, you've got to have a kick butt electronics engineer, somebody who knows how to tune the electronics based on the rider's feedback that he's giving to the team. You know, it's kind of scary, I would imagine, to be leaned over, railing a turn, and having everybody on your team tell you, just open the throttle wide, let the electronics do its thing, right? Just hammer the throttle, the electronics will save you. I don't know. I don't know if I want to ride that bike. I mean, sure, if you get to that point where you trust the electronics and you're doing what you've been told to do, I'm sure you're cutting a faster lap time. And at the end of the day, that's what it's about, cutting a faster lap time. But again, where you lose me is when you no longer have a throttle cable connected to your butterflies. That's just too far for me. It's too far. I love most of the features and the capabilities the electronics give you. Some of them I would not use, as we just discussed, but it's cool to have them, and it's cool as long as the power and control is in the rider's hand. In other words, I can turn traction control off if I don't want it. I can turn the power mode on to the highest power mode if I want it. I'm on full. You know, as long as you can configure it, as long as you can turn anti-wheelie off, right? If I pop a wheelie, I don't want the computer to retard the spark or do whatever it's doing to cut the power. Don't do that. Do what I tell you. Do what I tell you, do it well, and do nothing else. So I love the current era of motorcycles. I think this bike does a good job at balancing the electronics. It doesn't have an overbearing amount of electronics, and the rider has full control over everything. I hate the idea of, I twist this grip, and really what's happening is that's sending an electronic signal to a servo through wires that then open and close the butterflies on my throttle bodies, or back in the day, carburetors. that sucks, man. That really sucks. I don't think that's a good idea at all. I really don't. Okay, rant over. There you go. My favorite era is now for street bikes. It just is. I don't miss jetting carburetors. Hey, Gorilla Biker in the vent, you are still watching this video or watched it at all, got to this point, little tip for you, that that new Shred you just picked up has ram air, right? Your outer carburetors will run a larger main jet than your inner carburetors. So keep that in mind. I don't know if it runs the same needles. I'm sure that the pilot jet and air screwed, all that stuff is probably the same for in and outer carburetors. But your outer carburetors will get a lot more air from the ram air than your inside do. And so they do, you jet the outer carburetors differently than you do the inner carburetors. Just a little tip, you probably already knew that. Maybe you didn't, I don't know. But I've got the same bike basically, and I remember rejetting the carburetors when I put an aftermarket exhaust on it, went racing. Not that I needed to put an aftermarket exhaust on it to go racing, but I did. That's just what I did. I think that's all I got, folks. We'll see you in the next video. Keep the rubber side down and get out there and ride your bikes, man. I love this weather. Yes. All right. See you later. Bye.